All right, cities. Way to end the conference. I mean, I think this is always going to be a high-impact version of a conversation because the city is life. That was something that Esther Fuchs at Columbia told me. Let me start though with a very short video, which is going to set the stage for this conversation. So, this is Hollywood. Let's roll the video. There you go. So this is no ordinary disruption. It's also no ordinary panel. We have speakers who have a wealth of experience from economics, from technology, from infrastructure, and from design. So we're going to talk about cities, those economic engines that most Western executives, but I'm sure everybody in this room knows. And what they mean. What does this mean for the world in terms of its economic impact? What does it mean in terms of the sustainability? And what are the challenges and what are the innovative solutions? So that's kind of the agenda. And with me today, very briefly, I'm going to say is Neil Gordon, who speaks from the water perspective, as also having lived in Singapore, but working in the region for many years, has a deep understanding of the infrastructure that's needed to support sustainable growth. Benji Ward from Gensler, who's a leading architect and design, has been actually very much part of conversations particularly in China related to sustainable development, and I think has a lot to say about where China's going from a planning perspective. And of course, for the second time on a panel, Albert Wong, who's going to talk about the economic and technology angle of this, having, of course, years of experience from technology companies, and GE, of course, now also on the board of leading, actually, the Hong Kong Science Park. So welcome, everybody. And with that, I'm going to turn, first of all, to Neil to sort of talk a bit about the sustainability challenges, and particularly around water and infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. You started off by saying that cities are life, and life is water. And water is the underlying topic that I'm going to talk about. I'm here representing JM Eagle. JM Eagle is the world's largest manufacturer of plastic pipe. We are headquartered here in Los Angeles, so welcome to our home. But we have 20 plants across the country, the US, making both PVC and PE. Our motto is bringing good water to you, but we service a wide range of industry, everything from water and sewer to plumbing and irrigation to electric and gas. Here in the US, we work really closely with a wide range of government authorities and water municipalities to ensure that the water infrastructure is sustainable. Unfortunately, our current infrastructure here in the US is comprised of a high percentage of ductile iron. That ductile iron is highly corrosive, leaking a lot, and crumbling badly. Our goal is to have that infrastructure repaired with a smart solution, which is plastic pipe, which is cost-effective, long-term, green, and truly the right product. In China, we have 2 massive high-technology plants, and we're working hard on building business solutions in China for a very complex water supply issues. There's tremendous scarcity of water. a widespread pollution. And similar to the US, there is a crumbling infrastructure with a high degree of secondary pollution. And as a result, the vast majority of Chinese choose not to drink the water, the poisonous water that's coming directly out of their tap. And as you know, our dream, J.M. Eagle's dream, is for every Chinese citizen to turn on their tap and to have fresh, clean, healthy water. That's really the basic of civilization and a city. And so when we heard today at lunch the speaker talking about property values and cities, Shanghai, and it's beautiful cities above the ground, but unless we have smart, proper water management and a sustainable network and infrastructure below the ground, there really is no pathway towards economic success. So what I wanted to do was first talk about what are some of the issues. Can we switch to the second slide? Well, some of the issues that are in front of China with their water supply. The World Economic Forum earlier this year declared that the number one threat to humanity is water scarcity. Okay, and China is certainly experiencing that. There's 20% of the world's supply of people in China and only 7% of the world's fresh water supply. Especially areas in the north have very limited supply of water. On top of that, the water that is available is heavily polluted. After years of unregulated industry that just dumped waste into the waterways, farmers, agriculture run off with fertilizers and chemicals going into the waterways. I've read estimates of up to 60% of the water supply is just undrinkable, beyond pollution. And then here, like in the US, where there's a crumbling infrastructure, China has that times 10. And I think there's a lot that we can learn on the situation just looking at the infrastructure here in the US. Recently the American Society of Civil Engineers ranked the American infrastructure, and they gave us a D+. It's a disaster. There are over 800 water main breaks a day in the US. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because of using ductile iron pipes, we lose 3 trillion gallons of water a year through leakage under the ground. We never see this. That's 17% of the water supply. That situation is happening times 10 in China because we're using a waterways distribution that is unregulated. We have no idea what the materials that was being used in the pipes that were made. In addition, the water supply, there's thousands of water treatment plants in China. The water that the water treatment plants are putting out is good. But the problem is it's then going into the water distribution network. Distribution network that is leaking a very scarce commodity, and it's further poisoning clean water. Because what was the situation in Flint, Michigan, where lead was leaching into the water here in America? That's happening all across the board in China with their water distribution system because there is no control, there is no oversight like there here is in the US with AWWA, NSF, UL, overseeing what actually pipes are made of and that they're strong enough to hold and make sure they're up to a certain quality guarantee. In addition, we have secondary pollution. Secondary pollution where you have sewage pipe right next to water pipes. Both are corroding, both have leakage, so the sewage is leaking into the water supply. It's contaminating the water supply and further poisoning the water. That's happening across the board in China. It's really frightening. Okay? And then the third issue is it's kind of like you have too little, and then you have too much. It's climate change, excessive rain, which results in urban flooding. Right now, there's been so much urbanization and there's been so much concrete pouring everywhere in the big cities, the water, when it does rain, and it is an excessive rain, the water has nowhere to go but flow into the streets and to an overused sewer system already. That just breaks down, and there's highly economic, high-cost urban flooding, which is just disastrous for the communities. All these issues have to be addressed. All these issues have to be taken into consideration. There has to be a pathway for the future for there to be economic success.
Well, thanks. I think. I mean, it sounds like listening to that. Let's turn to Benji. Is there hope, Benji?
Yeah, let's hope so. We'll see. Some of this is doom and gloom, but hopefully not too bad. Oh, here we go. Okay, so most of you know that China right now is urbanizing at a pretty serious rate. 20 million people per year. I attended a conference in Beijing years ago where they suggested that one Canada every year was being built in China, which is just staggering. Today, 750 million people live in cities in China. By 2030, that number should be close to 1 billion. And the solution so far has been to take people from the rural areas and put them in places like this. This happens to be Lujiazui. It's a sort of prototypical city across the river in Shanghai. It is a great symbol of economic wealth, but the problems with it are that they chose to go vertical and forgot to think about the ground plane. So you see that the density here that's achieved in the skyline looks like any other wonderful CBD. If you look at Manhattan, it looks very similar, very dense in elevation. Same thing with Hong Kong. But if you look at the plan of it, it starts to tell you a very, very different story. That story is about the lack of density. So if I do a figure ground study with this, you notice that everything in green, those are buildings. Everything else is just empty space, whether it's places for cars or just massive sidewalks that are really not built for people, and they're really just about the buildings. So Edward Glaser is an amazing guy. He wrote this book a few years ago called The Triumph of the City, and he suggests that cities are the absence of physical space between people and companies. They are proximity, density, and closeness, and that's what creates sustainability. That's what creates these types of neighborhoods that were incredibly successful for hundreds and hundreds of years in China. They have sustainable social networks that are multi-generational and create really, really nice. Is there you, Neil?
I turned it off.
Oh, I think it still might be on.
I turned it off.
It's still on. Now, okay. So, and what they've traded this in for is this. And unfortunately, this is Beijing. This could be countless cities in China. They've gone from the horizontal to the vertical. They have taken those vertical towers and pushed them as far apart as possible to allow more light in, but basically making sort of these relationships disappear, and then carve them up with these massive freeways that really are not very good for creating social sustainable communities. So we tried to look at the sort of typologies around this, and I wanted to kind of get my head around what does it mean to be dense. And so we looked at low site coverage and high site coverage on the x-axis, low-rise buildings, and then high-rise buildings on the y-axis. And so we looked at Houston. Houston is always, unfortunately, the laggard here, probably one of the least sustainable cities in the world. Low site coverage and low-rise, almost suburban in its makeup. Paris, also low-rise, but interestingly enough, very, very high site coverage. It's a pretty amazing city. This is a new one. So Lujiazui, which I just showed you in Shanghai, is sort of, again, the prototypical city. This is happening all over Asia, in India, in Singapore, in Korea. We are building what we call super suburbs or mega suburbs, where they are very, very tall buildings, but they're very, very far apart. And the unfortunate part about that is that you create places where people don't want to live and they don't want to walk. They can't work, live, and play in the same neighborhoods. Hong Kong, always the great winner, is just an amazing city and incredibly dense, both vertically and on the ground plane. So Houston, quick numbers, 1335 people per square kilometer. And these are all to scale, by the way, so you'll start to see how this compares to each other. Now look at Paris, incredibly dense, but only about 6 or 7 stories. So you get that kind of density. It's 15 times the density that you get in Houston. If you look at Shanghai, Shanghai's got some of the tallest buildings in the world, especially right here in Lujiazui, but it still doesn't actually get to the density that Paris achieves only with 6 and 7 story buildings, and arguably Paris is a much nicer place to hang out than here. Hong Kong, and I'll switch between these two again. From here, this scale to this scale is exactly the same scale. It's amazing the density they achieve both vertically and on the ground plane in Hong Kong. So this just doesn't just happen in Shanghai. It happens in every city in China as they develop, and it is a really serious problem. So this is Beijing, then and now. This is Suzhou, all to scale. This is Luoyang. This is Chengdu, and this is Guangzhou. And this is a pretty serious contrast between the two, but you sort of get the point. They are building cities that are not walkable and not sustainable. So we looked at 4 well-intentioned policies that drive poor planning and promote a breakdown of the urban social fabric. And there's more to this, but just for a reason of brevity, issues with displacement. There are issues with setbacks and the codes around setbacks, placing buildings further apart from each other, building orientation laws, and then gated communities, the proliferation of these dreaded gated communities. So we at Gensler decided to get together and sort of brainstorm on what would be the sort of answer to this. And these are not new. You've probably seen all of these before in other presentations and in other theories. We just decided to put them all together and sort of test them. So the test was in a project that we did in Xi'an. This was what we actually came up with, and it wasn't because our design was terrible. It was we were just following the rules. So everything needed to be the same height. They needed to be a certain amount apart from each other. The roads were very wide, and it was not a mixed-use community. It was just a lot of residential, and so it leads to something that we call code-driven planning, which is not very nice. So we decided, let's strip that, let's start over. What if we put our principles to work? And our principles started with narrower roads, smaller sidewalks. This gives more developable area, connects you better to the rest of the city. Removing all setbacks, so the setbacks go all the way to the edge, more developable area, and again, putting the development closer to the city. Analyzing and preserving quality existing structures, really important for variation and also to maintain the history of the certain site. And this is the big one. Whoops, I skipped the big one. This is the big one. Abolish gated communities, reconnect the city. China is famous for designing mega blocks. And we want to make things that are a lot more walkable. And so by connecting with more roads, you have more encounters, you have more chance encounters with people, and you create a much more social city. Establish a mix of uses, encourages more diversity. And we talked earlier about this idea of live, work, and play within one area. This all happens here. You don't have to take your car or get in a taxi to go to another neighborhood to enjoy the city. Preserve the street wall. Pushing everything out to the outside is really important to preserve that street wall effect and create a pedestrian-friendly area. And then designing for views and daylight and nature rather than just facing everything south the way China does now. Take advantage of other things that people might want to see and other types of light. This is interesting too, and this is something that my hope that China is moving towards is the idea of sharing air rights. So property rights move from one property to another. And this creates more variation and more opportunity. And then, of course, transportation, multimodal transportation that allows people to move from one mode of transportation to another seamlessly. And that's sort of the difference. So we started on the left, and this is sort of current China policy. And our hope is that the way things are moving now in the new 5-year plan, that we are going to be moving further and further towards more of a sort of sustainably designed urban condition. So thank you.
Thank you, Benji. And so I think that was, first of all, a bracing sort of expose of Chinese urban planning history, but then some hope at the end there. Let me turn to you, Albert, on the economy. What do you see?
Well, I do not have this chart to talk about designing a city, but I would look at the cities from a different angle, from people's standpoint, from the young ones to the old ones to everyone in between. I want to talk about two things. One is about jobs in the future. I think we all see that as a problem. And when we talk about jobs, the first thing that we want to talk about is technology. That's my area. I want to talk about a few things about technologies that's happening that will affect what's going on in cities. When you talk about technology, the things that appear to all of us is about computing power and connectivities. These two are linked to each other. If there's only one of them, it's not going to work. Connectivity and computing power has been growing so quick in the past 20, 30 years. What it means is that we have a lot of data. I think you all know that there's a lot of data. And data doesn't mean anything. Data has to be transformed into information. And information is transformed into intelligence to make sense out of it. And right now, people are talking about data, but there's a lot of things to do between data to intelligence. So that would be a glimpse into the future. How do we use all this data? Now, I want to talk about a few things. Today, there are about, depending on who you talk to, about 50 to 200 billion sensors in the world. In other words, every one of us would have about 10 to 20, 50 sensors around us. In the next 20 years, we're talking about trillions of sensors. In other words, in the next 20 years, every one of us will have about thousands of sensors around us. And these sensors will be very cheap, will be plug and play. They will do the energy harvesting. You just plug there, they will do all the things for all this life. And it's going to happen in the next 20 years. What it means is that the Big Brother is always watching. That's number one. Number two is that there's a lot more data coming in. How do you make sense out of the data? And secondly, my favorite topic is genomics. 20 years ago, when you do a gene analysis of DNA, it takes 2 weeks. Nowadays, it takes 4 hours to analyze the whole genomics. That's another set of data, a lot of data coming up. What that means when I talk all this data, analytics, intelligence is that the machine intelligence is really happening. I'm seeing it in Hong Kong, even though Hong Kong is not at the forefront of so much forefront in technology. Artificial intelligence and deep learning is happening. You would think about a robot in the past is only doing those dull, repetitive works. Nowadays, robots can do a lot of creative stuff, including writing a song, including writing poem. Amazing. It's not perfect yet. They do translation. You know that Google Translate is pretty stupid, but it's improving. It's learning. That's because of all these data. Well, I'm saying all this because in the future, the jobs of the youngsters will not be the jobs of today. I had a meeting with a innovating company in Hong Kong just last week. This is probably a cliche. This guy makes a automatic welding machine. Automatic welding machine has been around for a long time. They do the welding on the pipes because they can walk around and weld. Nowadays, these guys can do artificial intelligence and do learning about how to do welding on irregular shapes. And I was saying that welders are hard to find these days, expensive. The future welders will be either the guy who moves the welders or the guy who programs. Nobody does the welding anymore in the next 20 years, right? Welding is only one of them. The one that I'm talking about is happening every day. I mean, you can imagine sweeping the street and collecting garbage. Those are hard to do in the past, but with the deep learning, artificial intelligence is happening. So our kids in the future will not be doing all this work. They will have to learn either to move things around, which is low level, or learn how to do programming. I think that's a big trend that I'm seeing. I think a lot of people are seeing in the cities, in the world. Technology with the data, with the analytics, is going one big way. Another thing that I want to talk about is that is the aging of the society. I think we can talk about technology further, but aging of the society is a big deal. In Hong Kong alone, or in Japan, in China. In Hong Kong, 50% of the hospital beds are occupied by 65 years or above. A lot of the spending is spent on the aging, on the age population. It is becoming a huge problem, probably with the exception of India, where someone was saying yesterday is still young, but you wait, it will happen. We try to tackle that problem from different angles, and aging is not one single problem. It is nutrition, it is monitoring, it's security, it is diagnostic, it is getting well, and also, by the way, it is end of life. Right? I once talked to a geriatrician, and he says that aging is not really high tech, although technology can help. Aging is a high touch kind of profession. It is going to happen. I also heard from one of the professions who said that when you are young, well, when we are old, we think about our young ages, our old times. When you are young, you wouldn't think about when you get old, right? So this is a problem. And in Hong Kong, at least where I sit, I run the Hong Kong Science Park. One of our platforms, well, we have 3 platforms: smart cities, robotics, and healthy aging. These are the 3 things that is happening, I think, in a lot of the metropolitan big cities. And we have to tackle them through technologies. So my angle is really from technology standpoint to look at how people live and potentially change the whole economy of these cities.
Thank you, Albert. And I think that's actually kind of very it's worth a round of applause, absolutely, because I mean it's it's hopeful, right? I mean it says that maybe the robots will take care of us. So
I'm sorry, on that note, that's a good discussion because if you think about it, Switzerland was voting for giving away free money like a few months ago, right? I think that's going to happen because we don't need to work. We need to learn how to program. There's no more labor. I think we got to think about a serious problem.
The world of work is definitely going to change. So I think we're starting to sort of come back from that trough of pessimism and the issues. We're seeing some optimism. Come back to you, Neil. So are there solutions?
Well, I painted
Positive.
a dire picture, but there are innovations that are quite remarkable and very interesting. I think they're taking issues that they've learned from other countries and other markets and have taken it a step further in China. Benji, you were showing high density in cities that, really if it did rain, where's the water going to go to? Well, China over the last 2 years has taken a lead from some projects in Singapore and as well as in the Pacific Northwest here in the US, and they've created 30 test pilots of sponge cities projects that will soak up all the water, that it just won't run into the streets and run into the rivers where flooding for society's troubles. It will create water catchments on the roofs of all the buildings. It will create permeable streets and sidewalks so the water will flow through into the underground. Catchments next to sidewalks. The goal is to, by the 2030, to have 80% of all urban areas have this permeable, this sponge feature added to it, capturing, I think I read like 70% of all water from the rain. This is fascinating to me and really an interesting idea to make sure that the water that is captured is used for gray water, it's used for irrigation, it's used for sewage, and therefore it solves an issue as far as the water scarcity issue, or at least somewhat eliminates a part of the issue. The other issue with infrastructure is, in a modern society, how do you have access? How do you continually see what's happening underground? And I look at what China's doing and I think back to Disneyland in the 1950s, where they created infrastructure tunnels under the ground. You never see anything happening in Disneyland here in Southern California. It's all magic underground. And that's what's happening in China. In the cities, they have these corridors underground that have all the sewage, all the water supplies, all the electrical. And every single industrial developer has to link to this corridor. So by doing that, you're creating a much better society where you can actually inspect your infrastructure. If there's problems with it, you know that you're losing the water. It doesn't result in massive water main breaks that disrupt society and loses millions of dollars just because you have to repave the road. So it's really some intelligent, smart solutions that we see starting to be initiated in China. And that's exciting for us. Challenges that remain. We here in the US, as I alluded to before, the water distribution system is heavily regulated by third parties, AWWA, American Water Works Association, UL, NSF. They all guarantee the quality of our infrastructure and that it will last for a specific number of years, that it's made of certain materials and it will not be poisoning the citizens. That's the next objective for JM Eagle, working hard in China to help improve not only the water distribution, but help the quality of the industry so that we are delivering across the board clean water. So our next goal is to go and take the standards from the US, those international standards, and bring it to China so that there is high quality distribution network systems being built.
That's great, and that also deserves a roundup because I think if they can do that, then we're going to have healthier cities. But on this challenge, so I mean, Neil, you sort of said that the next wave of challenges sort of take those international standards and bring them into China. So maybe, Benji, you want to talk a bit about kind of the reception to what you were saying? I mean, it's like these principles that Gensler was putting out there. Have you started to see those kind of things resonating within the Chinese government?
Yeah, well, so there is a sort of a happy, not a happy ending, but I guess a new happy beginning. I mean, you had sort of alluded to the new Shanghai plan, but I do know in the last few years, in the last few months, there has been a push by the government to start to adopt some of these ideas. And what's every 5 years there's a new 5-year plan. This 5-year plan very, very different from an urban standpoint. And actually, I've got a couple of the things that they mention. So in the new 5-year plan, they are suggesting 8 principles, a very lucky number in Chinese. Improve urban planning work, cultivate city character, improve urban architecture quality, expand energy efficiency in cities, improve public services in cities, create livable environments in cities, innovate on urban regulatory methods, and improve leadership. And this is the first time ever that I know of that these kinds of ideas are being pushed at a national level, and it's incredible. It's really exciting, and I'm not going to stand up here and say that Gensler had a lot to do with that, but I think that we were part of the conversation, and I think that people finally started listening, and it's good that we're moving in that direction.
Zeli, take the credit.
Yeah, I'll take all the credit. Yeah, it was actually me. So thanks. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And Albert, I mean, I guess I should have started. Obviously, this is a panel that's slightly weighted towards China. You might have picked that up. But I mean, Albert, Hong Kong is a crossroads. I'm just kind of wondering, do you see this, first of all, happening in other parts of Asia? I'm just wondering whether you might be able to say something about that. Or what is your view on this standards question? I mean, do you think China is going to be adopting standards, or is it going to be creating new ones for itself? And particularly as you talked through the technology and aging issues.
Yeah, by the way, I lived in China for a long time. I actually haven't lived in Hong Kong so much, although I'm local. I think the question about standards, the way I see it is that China is adopting our own standards. We have the GB, the CCC, all these industrial standards. And I think that's part of the protectionism. Because if you import all these US or European standards, they got to follow the others. So China will set up their own standard, which is, to a certain extent, copy of what the US, the Europe is doing. And I can test, because I used to run the GE oil and gas business in China, so I can see that is going on. Back to the Hong Kong discussion. I think Hong Kong has never been known to be an innovative technological city. Has always been a financial hub and logistics hub, trading port. But I think we come to realize that we cannot live like that. I mean, Hong Kong used to be low tech. We used to call ourselves low tech. We used to make these watches and plastics and things like that. But nowadays, Hong Kong is in a unique position. We're sitting at the back of the biggest market in the world, and we have the best legal system in the world, almost in flexible, rigid legal system, which is a good thing. Intellectual property protection, and these are the edges that Hong Kong is thriving on, compared with places like Singapore. We have a very similar system. The difference is that we have a big market sitting at our back. So this is one of the things that we're working on.
I know we don't have as much time, but I did want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, and I start to see hands raised. So great, there and there, but there first. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ram Park. I work with Grant Thornton, which is a global task consulting accounting firm. I've noticed that a lot of my clients are actually looking to move away from China, given just a lot of these new changes, regulatory, tax law changes, and just the cost of labor, skilled workforce is just no longer as competitive as it was 10, 15 years ago. So I see a lot of my clients actually moving to other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Thailand, even Malaysia to a certain extent, and Singapore obviously is also very important in terms of technology. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? And do you see China taking some sort of initiative to try to, curbed, foreign multinationals from actually investing and doing business in China. And especially with Hong Kong now, eventually going back to China rule, I know there's a lot of concerns with potentially my clients in Hong Kong that are thinking that they need to plan out of Hong Kong and go into another jurisdiction because of the eventual, migration back to China. So just your thoughts on those issues would be appreciated. Thank you.
Can I take that? First of all, Hong Kong is not eventually going back to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is already in part of China. So be politically correct. Anyway, first of all, China, for multinational, because I have a number of years in multinational, I think the answer to that question is that as a multinational, you have to be in China because it's the second largest economy in the world. You have to find a way to do it. People ask me as a senior executive at GE that people copy your technology. What do you do to protect it? Should I stay away from China? I said, you have to deal with it.
I would agree to a certain extent if you're dealing with Fortune 500 companies, but a lot of smaller private-owned companies or even smaller public companies, I don't see them.
Well, I would even argue that even for multinational 500, Fortune 500, it is tough. I'll tell you a story. 5 years ago, Jeff Immelt, our CEO, was in China. He met with Li Keqiang, the premier, and he came back to talk to us, and he says that at GE, well, I don't work for GE anymore, but at GE, our core cutting-edge technology is the aircraft engines. 5 years ago, Jeff Immelt met with the premier, and he came back to told us, the senior executive, that he said, I'm convinced that China will make its own aircraft engines in the next 20 years. Just 1 month ago, China announced that they're going to make it. So you have to find a way to deal with it. You have to, because you cannot ignore this market. And by the way, I think if you do business in China, you know the Chinese government are very pro-business. They want you to be there. But you have to be very, very careful that you have to protect your cutting-edge technology. But you cannot ignore that market. You have to find a way. That's my only answer. If you think that the biggest market in the world is not important, that's fine, that's a problem. I'll be honest, right?
Okay, I think there was a question right there. Yeah. And I'm only going to add one thing, that it is some segments of the economy are moving. That's fine. People should invest in Kampuchea. It helps them, but it's still more than enough.
Yeah, sorry, we call that labor arbitrage. You chase the cheapest labor. That's not what multinationals should do, because there's no end.
Dominic Ziegler from The Economist. I guess my question is really a sort of at heart a political one. I love the new planning vision that Benji Ward has laid out, but where was the civic input that could have prevented some of the planning disasters that produced the mega blocks and so forth? And where will it come from? And do you believe it's actually essential for this new mode of planning that you've laid out and that is, as I say, so appealing? And just a second question. If China is to move towards better urban neighborhoods, does that mean that there's going to be a Canada-sized demolition each year as well as a construction?
That's a good question. So the first part of the question, you have to sort of understand a little bit of the history of planning and how it started in China. And I think China at the end of World War II was beleaguered. It ended World War II and then a revolution on top of that. So it was really quite destitute. And the Russians were happy to help out, not only financially and militarily, but also through planning. And so most of the planning philosophies and all of the codes and regulations that were laid out stem from those times. And if you know anything about Moscow and the planning, I mean, it's horrible. So they learned from really probably the worst people on the planet how to design cities. So that's the first thing. So and what prevents it today is sort of those codes that I kind of outlined. I mean, they have programs that allow you to take a plan and put it in a computer, and the computer says, yes, you can build this, or no, you're not going to. And you know, and I sort of can't blame them. I mean, the fact is that China has gone through massive growth, you know, in the last 35 years, and there's no way you can do that by sensibly planning things. I think that it kind of, at this point, it is what it is. And so for us to stand here and say, oh, well, they should have done it slower, they should have done it more thoughtfully is it's past history. So that kind of brings me to your next question, which is what do you do with these cities? Do you demolish all of these cities? And I think that actually Jonathan and I were just talking about this earlier. Do you take a place like another prototype, and this would be a really wonderful study, do you take a prototype like Lujazwe with these huge avenues and horribly wide setbacks, and you have to take a cab from one building to the next? It's terrible. How do you take that and then redevelop that plan and overlay an infill plan on top of that? So all of a sudden Lujazwe starts to look a little bit like more like New York or Paris or Hong Kong on the ground plane. And is that possible? And I would say it is. I think it just takes a little bit of determination, which is something that China has a lot of. So why wouldn't they do it? But I'm very heartened by the new changes that are happening in China. It's exciting on a planning perspective.
Let me give you just 2 other data points on that. I'm very happy I'm here, but what I'm missing is the public consultation of Shanghai's 2016 to 2040 long-term plan, which is going on this weekend in Shanghai. Where they're inviting lots and lots of people to come in and just basically talk. There's a website called SEA-HI, which is the Shanghai Urban Planning and Design Research Institute's public forums, which is kind of cool to go on and look that up. So yeah, I mean, I think the philosophy even is becoming a little bit more civic. And then to your question, yeah, we think about 25% of the meters squared in China is replacement capacity, as in buildings that have been knocked down or been being rebuilt. And the average life of a building in China is about 24 years, I think, something like that. Compared to US, it's about 40-something, and Europeans are close like 55, which is a good thing, because those are not very good buildings. So. Yep, in the back. There was a question. He had his hand up.
Hi, Mehul Sharma. I just want to sort of follow up from what was just said about civic participation to say that in India, where we're just beginning our urban, build out, as it were. The real problem we're facing is that you need a clear way to make planners accountable to local populations. And this cannot be just an initial consultation. It's an ongoing process. And in the end, it's about direct political accountability. Now, when you have direct political accountability, you don't make giant mistakes. All right, and that is, sometimes you don't build anything, but you do not make giant mistakes. If you're trying to correct the giant mistakes of the past, you need a system that builds in direct political accountability. And I don't see that happening in China, right? So I do not see any system, especially any technocratic or AI-driven system, correcting the wisdom of crowds as expressed through political accountability. I just don't think that's possible. I don't know if maybe I'm missing something wrong there. And the second point is on the question of just pushing back against what Mr. Wong just said. Absolutely, multinationals should move to where labor is cheapest, especially if where labor is cheapest they get intellectual property protection, which they won't get in China, but they may get in large parts of the world. And absolutely, there is no connection between where you make your stuff and where you sell it. So there is no connection between China being the second largest market in the world and producing in China. People produce in China precisely because it has been efficient so far to produce in China, and that may not be the case any longer. And so unless you believe that China will turn protectionist, I don't see how that argument holds up.
Yeah, well, I cannot address the political question, but I will talk about the manufacturing location question. If you visit some of the bigger factories in China today, it's actually moving into a lot of automations. I was in a TCL manufacturing plant, which is, I don't know how to describe it. It's huge, but it's a dark factory. All right, a factory that is the second largest LED manufacturing in the world was manned by only 3,000 people. These 3,000 people are only doing maintenance and programming. So this is the future of manufacturing. So I totally disagree, or I do not agree with labor arbitrage going after the lowest manufacturing labor. So for China, let it be. You can go to Cambodia, Vietnam. We maintain the high-end manufacturing. That create another social problem where the lower skilled labor, where do they go? But as a reality. China doesn't want those low. Well, I don't represent the Chinese government, but it's okay. Let them have it, right? But if you go to some of the advanced manufacturing plants in China, we're talking about made in China 2025. We're talking about dark factories, right? And that's the future of that in everything because of artificial intelligence. Jobs in the future will be changed. I'm repeating myself, sorry. I cannot address the political question. Someone else have to do it.
Maybe, Vanilla, do you have any observations on how things are playing out at the city level in terms of people complaining about the quality of life? I mean, there's this famous joke. If you're a Beijing guy and a Shanghai guy, and the Beijing guy says, I'm so lucky. I just opened my window, I get a free cigarette. And the Shanghai guy, hey, that's nothing. I turn on the faucet and I get pork chop soup. So does this kind of jokes actually get some response?
Well, the interesting thing in China is that the use of bottled water is one of the fastest growing industries in China. And it is the fastest growing industry for bottled water around the world. However, to produce one bottle of water takes three bottles of water and half a bottle of energy, of oil. So it really is a waste of a precious water supply. And then there's no also additional element of considering what do you do with all that plastic afterwards? So if you have the world's largest population relying upon bottled water, I don't know. I think we really have to come up with and make sure that there is an infrastructure that is modern and sustainable.
We'll just take one more.
Hi, my name is Pranav Popa. Thanks for your comments. Two-part question. One, there's been a lot of talk about forward-looking and planning in China, but how about outside of China with existing cities? What excites you, or what is new in terms of strategies to improve existing cities in which getting anything done is, completely impossible because of the crowding? Take Bombay, for example. So would appreciate your thoughts on that. And then number two, many of these countries have different political systems, and so getting something done in China is a very different task than getting something done in India or elsewhere. And so how does that impact the planning process?
So the first one, and I don't know if you mind if I use sort of U.S. examples of this too. So we're working on a project right now that's going to be announced pretty soon for the Willis Tower, which is the Sears Tower in Chicago. Blackstone, which is a developer in New York, bought it last year for $1.3 billion, and they want to inject $1 billion worth of value into it, and it's obviously a very high-priced asset. And they've got lofty goals for it. But what I get excited about in cities like Chicago and mature cities around the world is that we have this unbelievable, authentic infrastructure like these towers, like the warehouse districts and so forth. People are moving into the core of the city. We're noticing that everywhere in the Midwest, not only in the Midwest, but here in LA. I mean, there's countless stories about how downtown is completely revitalized. The amount of restaurants and people living and working downtown is exciting. So in the Blackstone case, we are finding places in the city that before were sort of forgotten, basement levels, sky decks that no one knew were valuable all of a sudden. This is a really interesting fact. That people are going crazy over right now in the investment side is that if you look at the amount of money that is generated from the Empire State Building right now for just the observation deck, which is 2 floors, is $92 million a year. That's more than every other floor on the whole building takes in rent every year. So we combine. So that one spot is enough to generate revenue. So we're thinking about, architects now and designers have to think about generating revenue in a very different way. So it's not about making the shiniest, coolest new building or the coolest new neighborhood. It's about really trying to inject revenue generation and value in a much different way than we were thinking about before. So I'm really excited about this time in the world. I think that it's easier in mature cities right now, but I think Shanghai, those places that they made mistakes in 25 years ago, they're ripe for redesign as well.
Yeah, and I concur. I mean, this is what's exciting is that there are, in Asia, 30 to 40 million people every year show up in cities, and that is a revolution in the human condition, and that's how we all become ourselves in a much more true fashion. So, and I believe it also is democratic. It's fundamentally democratic. It's about people who have, greater opportunities to express themselves in whichever way they want to do. I was just reading Arrival City. I totally recommend this book. Sort of it gives you a whole new view on what is migration all about, and how these places where people arrive, what do they look like, and what do they want? And they want ownership, and they want creation of jobs, and they want family, and they want all the things you would expect they want, and they're going to get them. And that's what's the brilliant thing about this, is that these cities are transforming not only the countries, but the people. Quite literally, they're becoming taller. They're talking faster. Their brains are changing. They're having fewer kids. They're living longer. They are, things are becoming. We are transforming the human species. So incredibly exciting moment for all of us. We've spent our time on China, but by the same time, Seoul, dollars for donuts, is probably the single most exciting sort of example of urban development in Asia over the last 30 years. Amaravati, the new capital city for Andhra Pradesh, is going to be an amazing city. I mean, Chandrababu Naidu has a vision, and he is getting the best of the best to really be part of this. You should see what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, I have clients that are coming to me and saying that we need to use the city to change our social culture. And we know we have to. It's like a race against time. Sort of like we can see what happens if you don't. And it's just a little bit north. This is kind of cognitive behavioral therapy on a social scale. So that's why this is exciting.
Jonathan, Neil, Benji, and Albert, thank you guys very much for a thought-provoking conversation.